Imagine a life, meticulously constructed, brick by carefully placed brick, only to have its very foundations utterly obliterated by a single, unsuspecting revelation. Consider the weight of a secret, not just any secret, but one so profoundly disturbing, so fundamentally intertwined with the fabric of your existence, that its emergence shatters not only your understanding of your past, but the very essence of who you believe yourself to be. This isn't a work of fiction, not a twisted tale spun for entertainment. This is the raw, unvarnished truth of a life irrevocably altered, a family torn asunder, and the chilling, undeniable power of a single strand of DNA. We begin in a quiet, unassuming suburb, the kind where manicured lawns and friendly waves across fences paint a picture of idyllic normalcy. Here lived a man named David, a man in his early 40s, with the kind of reassuring presence that made him a pillar of his small community. David was a successful architect, his days filled with blueprints and client meetings, his evenings spent with his devoted wife, Sarah, and their two bright, inquisitive children. He was, to all outward appearances, the embodiment of the American dream, stable, content, and deeply rooted in the life he had so diligently built. Yet, beneath this veneer of perfection, a subtle tremor was beginning to ripple. It wasn't anything David could articulate, not a specific worry or a nagging doubt. It was more a faint echo from his past, a sensation of something unresolved, something just beyond his grasp. He'd been adopted as an infant, a fact he'd always known and, to a large extent, accepted without much introspection. His adoptive parents, Eleanor and Richard, had provided him with a loving home, a stable upbringing, and had never hidden the truth of his origins. They spoke of his birth mother with a gentle reverence, painting a picture of a young woman who, out of love and necessity, had made the difficult decision to place her child for adoption. David had always felt immense gratitude for their honesty and their unwavering affection. But as the years passed, a subtle shift occurred. The questions that had once felt abstract and distant began to crystallize, spurred by the innocent curiosity of his own children. "Daddy, where did you come from?" his daughter, Emily, would ask, her eyes wide with a child's pure wonder. "Do you have any other brothers or sisters?" His son, Michael, would chime in, ever the logical and inquisitive one. David would offer the same reassuring answers he'd always given. But a tiny seed of unease had been planted. He found himself scrolling through online adoption registries in the quiet hours of the night, not with any real expectation, but with a burgeoning sense of wanting to fill in the blank spaces of his own story. The turning point came not from a sudden revelation, but from a gift, a seemingly innocuous gesture intended to bring clarity and connection. Sarah, always thoughtful and attuned to his unspoken desires, had given him a DNA testing kit for his birthday. "Just for fun," she'd said, "to see your ancestry. Maybe you'll find out you're descended from royalty." David had laughed, but a flicker of something more profound ignited within him. This wasn't about royalty. It was about roots, about understanding the genetic tapestry that had woven him into existence. He sent off the sample, a small vial of his saliva, into the vast, impersonal machinery of genetic sequencing. The weeks that followed were filled with a strange mixture of anticipation and indifference. He'd almost forgotten about it when the email arrived, a notification that his results were ready. He opened it casually, expecting to see a pie chart of vague European percentages and perhaps a distant cousin or two. What he saw instead was a name that instantly, viscerally, sent a jolt through his entire being. Arthur Jameson. The name itself wasn't remarkable, but what followed it, the accompanying percentage of shared DNA, it indicated a very close relationship, far beyond that of a distant cousin. The report flagged him as a potential immediate family member. David's mind raced. A brother, perhaps? He had always secretly hoped for a sibling, someone who shared a piece of his unknown history. The thought brought a strange warmth to his chest, a feeling of burgeoning connection. He meticulously cross-referenced the name with what little information he possessed about his birth mother. He knew her first name was Maria, and that she had been young, barely out of her teens, when she'd given him up. But Maria was a common name, and the adoption records were sealed. This Arthur, however, had provided a birth date that aligned remarkably closely with David's own. Could it be? Could he finally have found a sibling? Driven by a surge of hope and trepidation, David reached out through the secure messaging system provided by the DNA service. He crafted a careful, almost overly formal message, introducing himself and explaining his connection. He waited, his phone clutched in his hand, for what felt like an eternity. The reply came a day later. It was brief, a simple confirmation of shared ancestry and a suggestion to connect further. Arthur had provided his phone number. David hesitated, his finger hovering over the dial pad. What if Arthur wasn't interested? What if this was all a mistake? But the urge to know, to finally unravel this thread of his past, was too strong to ignore. He took a deep breath and dialed. The voice on the other end was deep, a little gravelly, but with a warmth that immediately put David at ease. They spoke for over an hour, two strangers connected by an invisible thread of DNA, slowly piecing together fragments of their lives. Arthur revealed that he, too, had been adopted, though his adoption had occurred years earlier than David's. He was a few years older, in his late 40s, a quiet, contemplative man who worked as a librarian in a small town several states away. He spoke of a childhood similar to David's, filled with love and stability, but also with an unspoken yearning for his biological roots. As they talked, a pattern began to emerge. Similarities in their experiences, in their quiet curiosities, in their shared love for classical music and old black and white films. It was uncanny, almost as if they had known each other their entire lives. David felt a rush of exhilaration. This was it. This was his brother, the missing piece of his puzzle. He shared the news with Sarah, who was equally thrilled. "You have a brother, David. This is wonderful," she exclaimed, embracing him tightly. His children, too, were excited, envisioning new cousins and another branch on their family tree. The future suddenly seemed brighter, fuller, enriched by this newfound connection. David and Arthur made plans to meet, a tentative date set for a few weeks down the line, a midpoint rendezvous in a quiet little town. The anticipation was almost unbearable. David spent hours researching their shared interests, compiling a mental list of questions he wanted to ask Arthur. He imagined the stories they would share, the gaps in their lives they would help each other fill. He even started to see a faint resemblance in Arthur's profile picture. The same strong jawline, a similar intensity in the eyes. It was a mirror, reflecting a part of himself he hadn't known was missing. But then, the follow-up email from the DNA service arrived, a routine update, an analysis of potential closer matches that had been identified in the interim. David opened it, expecting nothing more than a confirmation of his relationship with Arthur. What he found instead sent a chill down his spine, a cold, creeping dread that began to snake its way through his veins. The new analysis wasn't about a distant relative. It wasn't about a third cousin once removed. It was a recalculation, a refinement, based on new genetic markers and algorithms. And it presented a relationship that defied all logic, all understanding. The words on the screen blurred, then sharpened into an horrifying clarity. Father/son. The name next to that impossible designation was Arthur Jameson. His brother, his newly found, long-lost brother, was not his brother at all. He was his biological father. The world tilted. The meticulously constructed life David had built, brick by carefully placed brick, began to crumble, not with a gentle tremor, but with the earth-shattering force of an earthquake. The air left his lungs, a suffocating weight settling in his chest. He reread the words, convinced it was a mistake, a glitch in the system, a cruel joke. But the percentages, the markers, the scientific precision of the report stared back at him, undeniable. Arthur Jameson, father/son. How could this be? How could the man he had just begun to embrace as a sibling, the man with whom he had shared an hour of intimate conversation, be his biological father? The implications were staggering, the ramifications unimaginable. His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the two impossibilities. Brother, father. The words clashed, creating a cacophony of confusion and disbelief in his head. This revelation didn't just rewrite David's personal history, it obliterated it. Every memory, every belief he held about his origins, his family, himself, was suddenly rendered meaningless, a cruel fabrication. The loving story of his birth mother, Maria, making a difficult but selfless choice, what did that mean now? If Arthur was his father, then who was his mother? And how could Arthur be his father if he was only a few years older than David? The timeline didn't make sense, twisting into a grotesque knot that defied reason. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. He felt a sudden, profound nausea, as if the very ground beneath him had opened up and swallowed him whole. His carefully constructed identity, built on the solid ground of adoption and a known, if somewhat mysterious, past, had just imploded. And in its place, a gaping chasm of uncertainty and an unspeakable horror yawned open. This was not a pleasant surprise, not a heartwarming reunion. This was a nightmare, slowly, inexorably, unfolding. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was just the beginning. The truth, in its raw, unfiltered brutality, was only just beginning to reveal its agonizing face. And he was standing utterly alone, on the precipice of its terrifying revelation. The initial shock, a pure, undiluted terror, slowly began to recede, replaced by a churning maelstrom of confusion, anger, and a profound sense of betrayal. David tried to rationalize it, to find any logical explanation for the DNA results. Perhaps there was a mistake in the lab, a mix-up of samples, a glitch in the algorithm. He clutched at these straws of hope, desperate to avoid the unthinkable truth staring him in the face. He emailed the DNA company, his fingers trembling as he typed out a frantic inquiry, demanding a retest, a re-evaluation, anything that would negate the horrifying reality. The automated response was swift and unyielding. Our results are highly accurate. We recommend further investigation into your family history. Further investigation. The words mocked him, reverberating in his mind. What further investigation could there be when the very bedrock of his understanding had just been shattered? He didn't know how to approach Arthur. The man he had spoken to just days before, the man he had envisioned as his long-lost brother, was now revealed to be something far more complex, far more disturbing. How do you confront someone with such an accusation? How do you even begin to articulate the unfathomable? The very thought of speaking to Arthur, of seeing him, filled David with a sickening dread. The warmth he had felt during their first conversation had curdled into a bitter resentment, a sense of having been unknowingly deceived. Sarah, his anchor in the stormy seas of his life, quickly picked up on his distress. She found him in his study, staring blankly at the computer screen, the DNA report still glowing menacingly. Her usual cheerful demeanor faltered as she saw the pallor of his face, the haunted look in his eyes. "David? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. How could he tell her? How could he explain something so grotesque, so fundamentally unnatural? He took a shaky breath, then another, trying to steady himself. "Sarah," he began, his voice hoarse. "The DNA results, they weren't what we thought." He handed her the laptop, watching her face as she read the report. Her eyes widened, a look of pure bewilderment quickly giving way to disbelief, then horror. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, this can't be right. Arthur, your brother, your father? David, this is impossible." She reread the report, her brow furrowed in a desperate attempt to make sense of the nonsensical. "There has to be a mistake," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate edge. "A scientific error. It has to be." But even as she spoke the words, a cold certainty settled between them, a shared understanding of the terrifying implications. They sat in silence for a long time, the quiet of the room amplifying the chaos within their minds. The life they had built, the future they had envisioned, seemed to hang precariously by a thread. "Who is his mother, then?" Sarah finally asked, her voice laced with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "If Arthur is your father, then who gave birth to you?" The question hung in the air, a terrifying void. David had always believed his birth mother was Maria, a young woman who had made a difficult choice. But if Arthur was his father, then Maria's role was entirely different, or perhaps even non-existent in the way he understood it. The narrative of his birth, the very first chapter of his life, had been completely erased, replaced by a horrifying blankness. Sleep became an elusive luxury. David spent his nights tossing and turning, his mind replaying every detail of his conversation with Arthur. He scrutinized Arthur's words, his tone, searching for any hint, any subtle clue that might have foreshadowed this revelation. He remembered Arthur mentioning his own adopted status, his own search for answers. But there had been no hint of this, no whisper of the dark secret that lay buried beneath the surface of their seemingly innocuous conversation. The weight of the secret became suffocating. He couldn't bring himself to talk to his children, to shatter their innocent understanding of their family. How could he explain that their beloved father's newfound brother was, in fact, his biological father? The implications for them, for their perception of their own lineage, were too profound to contemplate. He felt a fierce, primal need to protect them from the ugliness of this truth, even as it consumed him. Driven by a desperate need for answers, David decided he had to confront Arthur. Not over the phone, not through a sterile email, but face to face. He needed to look the man in the eye, to see if there was any flicker of recognition, any sign that he knew the truth, that he had been living a lie for all these years. He booked a flight, a one-way ticket to the quiet town where Arthur lived, a town that now seemed imbued with a sinister aura. The journey was a blur of anxiety and adrenaline. Every mile brought him closer to a confrontation that he knew would irrevocably change his life, and potentially Arthur's. He imagined various scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. Would Arthur deny it? Would he confess? Would he even be surprised? He arrived in the quaint, sleepy town, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. The library, a charming old building with ivy climbing its brick walls, was easy to find. David stood across the street, watching Arthur through the large, arched windows. Arthur was shelving books, his movements calm and methodical, seemingly oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred in David's world. He looked unassuming, almost ordinary, a figure who could have been any other man in any other small town. And yet, this ordinary man held the key to an extraordinary, terrifying truth. David took a deep breath, steeling himself. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped inside. The air was cool, smelling faintly of old paper and dust. Arthur looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as he recognized David. A slow smile spread across his face. "David, what a surprise. I thought we were meeting next month. What brings you to this quiet corner of the world?" His voice was genuinely warm, welcoming. It was the voice of a man who believed he was greeting his long-lost brother, a voice devoid of malice or deception. And that, in itself, was perhaps the most unsettling thing of all. Arthur had no idea. Or did he? The doubt gnawed at David, a relentless torment. "Arthur," David began, his voice strained. "We need to talk. It's about the DNA results." Arthur's smile faltered slightly. "Oh? Did they find some long-lost European ancestor? Or maybe we're even more closely related than we thought." "I knew it. I always felt a connection, a kinship." He chuckled, a light-hearted sound that grated on David's raw nerves. David took another deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm, to articulate the unspeakable. "Arthur," he repeated, his voice low, "the most recent results, they indicate a different relationship, a much closer one." He paused, searching Arthur's face for any flicker of understanding, any sign of complicity. There was none, only an innocent, if slightly confused, curiosity. "A closer one?" Arthur asked, his brow furrowing. "Like full brothers instead of half-brothers? That would be amazing." David shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, Arthur. Not brothers." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, charged with a mixture of anguish and accusation. "The results show that you are my biological father." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, shattering the quiet serenity of the library. Arthur's face, which had been open and receptive, went utterly blank. His eyes moments ago filled with a gentle warmth, now reflected a dawning horror, a profound shock that mirrored David's own initial reaction. The book he had been holding slipped from his fingers, landing on the polished wooden floor with a soft thud that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. He swayed slightly, as if struck by an invisible blow. My father?" he stammered, the words barely a whisper. No, that's impossible. David, you must be mistaken. There's been a terrible error." The denial was immediate, instinctive, but David had seen the report, had felt the cold, undeniable grip of its truth. "There's no mistake, Arthur," he said, his voice firm, though his heart was pounding against his ribs. "I've checked with the company. They confirmed the results. Father and son. It's you, Arthur. You're my father." Arthur stared at him, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a rising terror. The composure he had maintained moments before had completely vanished, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of an unimaginable truth, a truth that had just ripped through the carefully constructed lives of two men, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. The silence in the library was deafening, punctuated only by the shallow, ragged breaths of Arthur. His face, once open and warm, was now a mask of profound shock and a dawning horror. He looked utterly bewildered, as if the very foundations of his world had just crumbled beneath his feet. My father?" he repeated, his voice a hoarse whisper, full of disbelief. "David, you must be mistaken. This is some kind of cruel joke." David, though shaken, held firm. He had lived with this agonizing truth for days, had wrestled with its implications, and now he needed answers. "It's no joke, Arthur," he said, his voice low but steady. "The DNA doesn't lie. It's conclusive. You are my biological father." He watched Arthur's face intently, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that this wasn't entirely new to him. But there was only raw, unadulterated shock. Arthur sank slowly onto a nearby chair, his legs seemingly unable to support him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a silent tremor. David stood over him, a storm of emotions raging within him, anger, pity, a desperate longing for an explanation. I don't understand," Arthur finally managed, his voice muffled by his hands. How can this be? I was adopted. I never knew my birth parents. I never had a child." David felt a sudden pang of compassion, despite the turmoil in his own heart. Arthur genuinely seemed to be as blindsided by this revelation as he himself had been. "I know you were adopted, Arthur," David said, his voice softening slightly. "But so was I. My birth mother's name was Maria. Do you know a Maria?" Arthur lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a haunted confusion. "Maria?" he repeated, the name seeming to spark a faint, distant memory. I think so. There was a girl when I was very young. A long time ago, before I was adopted. But she was just a friend, a childhood friend." His voice trailed off, a new layer of horror dawning in his eyes as he began to put the pieces together, however fragmented they were. "How old were you, Arthur?" David pressed, a cold dread beginning to coil in his stomach. The timeline, which had seemed impossible, was now beginning to twist into something unspeakably monstrous. Arthur looked away, his gaze unfocused, lost in the murky depths of a long-buried past. I was young, 14, maybe 15. He paused, then his eyes snapped back to David, filled with a sudden, agonizing comprehension. "No," he whispered, a sound of utter disbelief and revulsion. "No, it can't be. Not Maria. Not like that." The pieces, which had been stubbornly resisting, now clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening finality. David felt a wave of nausea wash over him. 14. 15. Arthur, a child himself, had fathered a child. And that child was David. And the mother was Maria. A child, giving birth to a child, fathered by another child. The implications were too terrible to fully grasp, too profoundly disturbing to even voice. "Who was Maria, Arthur?" David demanded, his voice now laced with a raw edge of despair. "Tell me everything. Who was she to you?" Arthur finally began to speak, his voice choked with emotion, fragmented memories spilling out in a torrent. He spoke of a troubled childhood, of being shuffled between foster homes before his eventual adoption. He remembered Maria as another child in the system, someone he had clung to for a sense of normalcy and companionship. They were both adrift, both seeking solace in each other's presence. He described a brief, innocent, yet ultimately devastating encounter, born out of loneliness and confusion, in an environment where guidance and protection were woefully absent. It was not a relationship, not a conscious act of creation, but a tragic consequence of two vulnerable children lost in a system that had failed them. The story was a tapestry of neglect, innocence lost, and a devastating lack of intervention. Maria, only a few years older than Arthur, had become pregnant. In the harsh realities of their situation, with no support system and no understanding of what was happening, the pregnancy had been hidden, the birth a secret, and the baby, David, given up for adoption almost immediately. Arthur had been moved to a different foster home shortly after, eventually finding stability with his adoptive parents, Eleanor and Richard, who had shielded him from the traumatic memories of his early life. He had genuinely forgotten the details, or perhaps, in the deep recesses of his mind, had actively suppressed them as a survival mechanism. The brief, innocent encounter with Maria, the child, had been buried under layers of time and trauma, never to surface until this moment. David listened, numb with shock. The story wasn't one of a deliberate act, but of a horrifying tragedy. It didn't diminish the pain, but it reframed the narrative. His birth wasn't a secret kept by a calculating individual, but a forgotten, suppressed trauma of two children who were themselves victims of circumstance. "So, you never knew?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You never knew I existed?" Arthur shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Never. I swear to you, David, I never knew. I barely remembered Maria's name, let alone what happened. My adoptive parents, they gave me a new life. They helped me forget the past. I honestly thought that was all behind me." The raw grief in Arthur's voice was undeniable. He wasn't acting, wasn't fabricating a story. This was the genuine shock and agony of a man confronted with a horrifying truth he had unknowingly carried for decades. He was not only David's father but, in a way, another victim of the same tragic circumstances that had led to David's birth. David felt a strange mix of emotions. The initial anger, the sense of betrayal, began to recede, replaced by a profound sadness. This was not the evil villain he had perhaps, subconsciously, prepared himself to confront. This was a broken man, grappling with a devastating revelation that implicated him in a tragedy he hadn't even known existed. "What about Maria?" David asked, the question heavy with a renewed sense of urgency. "Do you know what happened to her? Is she still alive?" Arthur shook his head slowly. I don't know. After I was moved, I never saw her again. I tried to find her once, years ago, when I started looking for my own biological family. But the records were so fragmented, so hard to trace. I eventually gave up. I never imagined this." The conversation continued for hours, a raw, painful excavation of a shared past they had both unknowingly inhabited. They talked about their adoptive families, their lives, the disparate paths that had led them to this impossible reunion. David learned that Arthur, despite his quiet demeanor, had always carried a subtle undercurrent of loneliness, a feeling of being unmoored, which now, in retrospect, made horrifying sense. He had unknowingly been searching for his son, even as David had been searching for his father. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the library, David felt a profound exhaustion settle over him. The initial shock had given way to a deep, pervasive grief, not just for himself, but for Arthur, for Maria, for the cruel hand of fate that had dealt them all such a devastating blow. The future, which had seemed so clear just days ago, was now a swirling vortex of uncertainty. How do you integrate a truth like this into your life? How do you tell your wife, your children, that their Uncle Arthur is, in fact, your biological father, conceived in a moment of tragic innocence and buried under decades of forgotten trauma? The immediate urge to flee, to erase this horrific truth, was strong. But as he looked at Arthur, a man now as vulnerable and broken as David felt, a different emotion surfaced. A tentative, fragile sense of connection. This man, this victim of circumstance, was his father. And David, in turn, was his son. The biological bond, however tragically formed, was undeniable. The question wasn't if they would acknowledge it, but how they would navigate this impossible new reality. The burden of this secret, the weight of its implications, now rested squarely on both their shoulders. And David knew, with a chilling certainty, that their journey to understanding and acceptance had only just begun. The path forward was dark, uncertain, and fraught with unimaginable pain, but it was a path they would now have to walk together. The long journey back home was a blur of fragmented thoughts and raw emotions. David replayed every moment of his conversation with Arthur, dissecting each word, each tremor in his voice. The initial shock had given way to a profound sense of sorrow, a grief not just for his own fractured identity, but for the lost childhoods of Arthur and Maria, two vulnerable individuals caught in a system that had failed them so catastrophically. The narrative of his birth had shifted from a mysterious unknown to a tragic, almost unbearable reality. Sarah met him at the door, her face etched with worry. One look at his exhausted, haunted expression was enough. She didn't need to ask. She simply pulled him into a tight embrace, a silent anchor in the storm raging within him. "He didn't know, Sarah," David murmured, his voice hoarse. "He truly didn't know. It was different than I imagined. Worse, in a way. So much more tragic." He recounted Arthur's story, the fragmented memories of a childhood lost, the innocent yet devastating encounter with Maria, another child in a system that had failed to protect them. Sarah listened, her own eyes welling up with tears. The sheer weight of the tragedy, the profound injustice of it all, was almost too much to bear. The days that followed were a painful blur of introspection and difficult conversations. David and Sarah spent hours talking, trying to process the enormity of the revelation. How do you tell your children that their family tree has just been violently uprooted and replanted in a landscape of unimaginable trauma? How do you explain that their Uncle Arthur is, in fact, their paternal grandfather, born of a circumstance so heartbreakingly inappropriate it defies comprehension? They ultimately decided to tread carefully, to protect their children from the full, brutal truth until they were older and better equipped to understand such complexities. For now, Arthur would remain Uncle Arthur, a beloved figure who had unexpectedly entered their lives. The deeper, darker truth would remain a secret, a heavy burden they would carry, shielding their children from its crushing weight. David maintained contact with Arthur, their conversations now tinged with an unspoken understanding of their unique, tragic bond. They talked about their lives, their shared interests, slowly, tentatively building a relationship not as brothers, but as father and son, albeit one forged in the crucible of unimaginable circumstances. It was an awkward, often painful dance, but one they both felt compelled to undertake. Arthur, for his part, was eager to learn about the son he never knew he had, to try and bridge the chasm of decades that separated them. He expressed a profound remorse, a deep and heartfelt sorrow for the circumstances of David's birth, even though he had been an unwitting participant. David found himself grappling with a complex mix of emotions. There was still a residual anger, a sense of injustice that his identity had been so fundamentally distorted. But alongside it, a strange sense of empathy for Arthur began to grow. Arthur was not a villain, but a fellow victim, a boy who had been forced to bear an unimaginable burden without even knowing it. This understanding, though painful, began to pave the way for a fragile form of acceptance. One evening, David sat alone in his study, the DNA report still lying on his desk, a stark reminder of the truth. He picked up his phone and found Arthur's number. He hesitated for a moment, then dialed. "Arthur," David began, his voice soft. "I've been thinking. I want to learn more about Maria, about my mother. Do you think we could try and find her together?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then Arthur's voice, thick with emotion. "David, are you sure? It might be difficult, painful." "I know," David replied, his voice firm. "But I need to know. For myself. And for her. She was just a child, Arthur. She deserves to be remembered, to have her story told. And I need to understand everything, to finally complete the puzzle." Arthur agreed, his voice tinged with a newfound hope. "Yes, David. Yes, let's do it. Together." This was the next chapter in their improbable story, a journey not just to uncover a forgotten past, but to seek healing and understanding. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more pain, more revelations, but also the possibility of closure, of finally bringing some peace to the ghosts of their past. The burden of this truth, once suffocating, was now shared, and in that shared burden, there was a glimmer of hope, a fragile promise of a future, however unconventional. The revelation of David's true parentage was a devastating blow, a seismic event that reshaped his entire understanding of his life. Yet, from the ashes of that shattering discovery, a new path emerged, one of profound healing and an unexpected connection. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the enduring power of family, even when that family is defined by the most unimaginable circumstances. This story, like so many others, reminds us that the human experience is a tapestry woven with threads of joy and sorrow, of shocking revelations and enduring love. It challenges us to look beyond the surface, to embrace the complexities of identity, and to acknowledge the hidden histories that shape us all. If David's journey, filled with such raw emotion and unexpected turns, resonated with you, if it left you questioning the boundaries of what you thought possible, then I urge you to engage further. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of David's story affected you the most? How do you think you would react to such a revelation? Your perspectives are invaluable. And if you want to continue exploring these extraordinary stories of human connection and resilience, remember to like this video. Your likes help us reach more people who might find comfort or understanding in these narratives. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you don't miss any of our upcoming content that delves into the depths of human experience. And most importantly, hit that notification bell so you're always the first to know when a new, compelling story is ready to unfold. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful, often life-altering, narratives to light. Thank you for being a part of our community.